I'm the evaluation manager at TASO. My name is Rain Sherlock, and I'm just going to be giving you a kind of brief overview to our session today, what we're going to cover, and the work that we've been doing on validating questionnaire scales over the last kind of 6 months to a year. We do have a number of panelists with us today. So we've been working with researchers from the Brilliant Club and also from the University of Cambridge on this project. And we have Lauren from the Brilliant Club with us today, and also Sonia from the University of Cambridge. You're going to hear from them quite a lot throughout the session. We do also have a colleague from HEAT with us today. Nina is on the call, and she will be joining us for the Q&A at the end of the session, because as you will find out, you can also use this questionnaire tool via HEAT, and she'll be able to help answer any questions you might have on that. So just another reminder to please pop your questions in the Q&A box as we go, and we will come to those towards the end of the session. I think let's get started. So just a brief overview of what we're going to cover. I'll do a kind of quick intro to TASO. We're going to give you a little bit of background about the project and the work we've been doing. And then we're going to try and spend the majority of our time actually introducing you to the Widening Participation Questionnaire and how to use that. We're also going to show you in quite practical terms how to use it. So we'll kind of show you some screen grabs of the TASO website and talk you through the HEAT tool. Our hope is that you leave today with a really clear idea of what it is, how it can help you in your evaluation, and how in practical terms you can actually access it and start to implement it in your work within your teams. We will have time for the Q&A at the end, so we'll get to all your questions. By way of a kind of brief introduction, I imagine many people on the call are familiar with TASO or have some familiarity with TASO. We're an independent hub that are here to support higher educational professionals with evaluation and research needs. We have a number of toolkits, evaluation guides, methodology guides, and they can all be found on the TASO website. One of those is this questionnaire that we're launching today, and that will also be able to be found on the TASO website. We are an independent charity. We were actually set up by a consortium of 3 partners, so by the King's College London, by Nottingham Trent University, and also by the Behavioural Insights team. But we spun out over a year ago, and we're now an independent charity, and we sit in something called the Evidence Quarter in London, which is where a number of What Works centres are housed. So we are an affiliate What Works centre, which is a group of kind of 9 evidence centres that have been set up to support with the implementation of kind of evidence-informed policy across government. Obviously, we're focused on higher education. You can see at the bottom here that we are funded by the OFS, and that current funding cycle runs up until 2023. So we're very grateful for that funding as well. I often start with this slide, and again, I imagine it's one that's become quite familiar to anyone who's attended previous TASO workshops, and it's taken from something called the Monitoring and Evaluation Framework that TASO uses. And what you can see is what we call the evaluation cycle, or the kind of wheel of evaluation. And we think of evaluation at TASO as being reiterative, which is very much demonstrated in the kind of circular motion of this diagram. So our kind of hope is that the sector can use the evaluation cycle or the monitoring and evaluation framework in such a way where each stage or each phase that you're working on should inform and bolster the next phase in your evaluation, and that year on year you can kind of see continuous improvement as you go through that cycle. So today we are focused on the measure phase. We're going to be talking about quite a practical tool for data collection and collecting information about intermediate outcomes in a kind of consistent and valid way. But that doesn't exist in isolation. Prior to getting to the measure stage, we do need to think about the plan phase. This is where you would plan your evaluation methodology, the research questions that you're hoping to answer. And it is important that that work is done prior to coming to the measure phase. Equally, once you have collected your data and you've used the validated questionnaire scale, you need to analyze that data and then think about how to kind of mobilize the insight or knowledge that comes from that. So it should also feed into the reflect phase. So this is just trying to demonstrate that what we're talking about today is definitely situated in a wider conversation about evaluation. We are going to focus on measure today, but I do encourage you to try and think about it in context as well. So In a moment, I'm going to be handing over to our panelists, but before I do that, I wanted to just spend a couple of moments kind of actually unpacking what do we mean by validated WP questionnaire, so widening participation questionnaire, and what do we mean by intermediate outcome. Hopefully by the end of this session, you can actually answer those questions in much more detail and have a better understanding. But just briefly, this guidance and the validation work that we've done so far was very much in response to a request that came from the sector. So we were hearing quite a lot that there wasn't a kind of consistent and reliable way to measure intermediate outcomes that are important to us in WP. So these might be things like sense of belonging, academic self-efficacy. And so we have responded to that by trying to narrow down a list of kind of key intermediate outcomes that are important to the sector and that matter for later success in higher education, and then give you a very practical tool to be able to measure those outcomes. So validator scale quite simply just means a kind of set of statements or questions, I don't know if you can see my cursor, that reliably track back to one underlying outcome and measure exactly what they're intended to measure. So we've tried to illustrate this in this small diagram. You can imagine here that the outcome could be academic self-efficacy, and each of these items would be a statement or a question that informs academic and relates to academic self-efficacy. We will talk through that validation process in more detail as we go, but the questionnaire items that we're going to talk through today have all been through a multi-step validation process to get them to this point. And then an intermediate outcome is just a kind of shorter term, or often what we think of as a proxy measure for a longer term outcome. So often in higher education, we're interested in things like access to HE or key stage attainment that might become a predictor of access to HE, but we can't always measure those things up front. We might be working on a kind of shorter timeline, and there are key intermediate outcomes that are important or related to those later outcomes. And the questionnaire scales that we have developed and that we're going to share with you today are focused on those intermediate outcomes. It is just worth noting briefly, although it's not a conversation for today, that the process of validation that we're going to be talking you through can be used for all sorts of outcomes. It doesn't exclusively need to be the intermediate outcomes that we're focused, the kind of type of intermediate outcome that we're focused on today. So if you're interested in the validation process in a wider sense, there is some guidance on the TASO website, and it can be applied more widely. So before I hand over to our panelists, I wanted to just take a moment to show you who has been working on the project so far. So as I mentioned, it's been a kind of three-way collaboration between TASO and then also researchers from the Brilliant Club and the University of Cambridge. So we've got Sonia and Konstantina from the University of Cambridge, and Sonia is here to help us with the webinar today. And then similarly, we have Lauren and Hannah who have joined us from the Brilliant Club, and we'll be hearing more from Lauren actually in a moment. So I'll hand over to you, Lauren.
Lovely, thank you very much, Rain, and afternoon, everybody. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some background to the project, and then Sonia will talk in a bit more detail about the validation process. So we can move on a slide, please. And so this is an overview of the project. And so we've been working on this project for coming up to a year now, and I'm going to talk through the consultation and review process and really what we're sort of shaping and informing the decision behind the intermediate outcomes that we chose for the scales. And then, as I said, Sonia will talk through the validation process in more detail. And really, we're at the point now, phase 3, where we have the multi-scale questionnaire, and we really want to work with the sector to pilot it. And so we will talk also more to the practicalities of doing that. Okay, so this exciting moment, this is the widening participation questionnaire. And so these are the intermediate outcomes included in the questionnaire. And so they cover a range of cognitive, motivational, and social outcomes. And you can also see that we've grouped them in terms of whether they relate to access or whether they relate to success. And another important thing to say on this slide is that we've been really intentional about the definitions that are linked to these intermediate outcomes. I think often what we find is that it's really, it can be quite difficult when you're using an outcome to refer to different definitions, or if you're using an intermediate outcome in slightly different ways. So we wanted to be really intentional and also really explicit about the intermediate outcomes that we're using and also the definitions that underpin them. And then we just move on one more. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just take you back to phase 1 of the project and just sort of give an overview of some of the key findings. And so a really important thing we're trying to do within this project is to work with the sector through a consultation process. And so really understanding the intermediate outcomes that matter within the widening participation and student success work that individuals and institutions are delivering. And also understanding what are some of the practical difficulties and practical challenges. And so within the consultation, we administered our very own questionnaire. And as part of this, we were asking individuals what intermediate outcomes are particularly important for your higher education and student success work. And what we did was we provided individuals with a list of 7 intermediate outcomes. And we drew this from the research literature, but also from outcomes that we knew were popular and outcomes that were already widely used within the sector. And so what we see in terms of this ranking is that 50% of the individuals that completed the questionnaire said that aspirations and expectations was most important, and that study skills and metacognition was least important. And then you can also see that in the triangle as well. And I think this is really interesting for a number of reasons, but sort of in particular because we know there's really strong links with metacognition study strategies and that connection through to improvement in attainment, and therefore the connection that has then to university access. And so we will move on to the next slide. And so this is sort of the missing piece of the puzzle. So alongside the questionnaire that we administered, we also delivered a number of focus groups. And so really trying to understand the context in which people are working. And I think what was really interesting was that there was a very strong sense that individuals in institutions were really competent about measuring outcomes such as aspirations, competence, and HE knowledge, but they were less competent about measuring things such as study strategies and metacognition. And so I think interestingly, so what we're seeing from the quantitative data from the questionnaire about the kind of relative importance of metacognition, study strategies, kind of relative to aspirations, expectations, is sort of really more about a measurement issue. And really what we were getting from conversations is that institutions and individuals really wanted to support with sort of the measurement of these more cognitive outcomes. And then another really clear message that came through from the focus groups was that individuals were either creating their own questionnaires or people were using existing questionnaires from the research literature. And I think sort of collectively, there was a sense that there were concerns over the suitability of the measures. And so either with the questionnaires that were self-designed, whether they were robust and whether they were fit for purpose. And then with the existing questionnaires, whether it was really well suited to a widening participation context. And really what we're trying to do with this project is we're trying to bring together questionnaires which are validated, but also that are fit for the context in which we're all working in. Okay, we just move on another slide. And so a really important part of this project was reviewing the research literature. And so we conducted an evidence review, which was led by Hannah Thompson from the Brilliant Club. So I believe Hannah is also on the webinar, but just to give a brief shout out to her. And so we've looked at a range of different intermediate outcomes, and all of that is reported and covered in the evidence review. But in particular, from the research which we reviewed, it was really clear that there was a set of intermediate outcomes that were really strongly associated either with academic attainment or with HE progression and retention. And so these are the outcomes which are listed on this slide. And so that was a really important part, which was then going to inform what we were going to take forward in the widening participation questionnaire. And then if we just move on one more. And so really and this is my final slide before I hand over to Sonia, but it really was a combination of the consultation that we did with the sector. So really understanding what's happening in practice, what are some of the difficulties, what are some of the challenges, but also what are the outcomes that institutions consider important for their specific access in student success work. And then also sitting that alongside the evidence and so what we know about intermediate outcomes, and then connections with improvement in access, but also linked to student success as well. And I suppose my kind of final comment is that a big part of the evidence review was in and around attainment, because that was the kind of existing and the kind of available intermediary outcome between the intermediate outcomes we're looking at, and then those overall long-term outcomes of access and success. And so that was really did play a really important part in that evidence review. And then those two things together, we then generated the widening participation questionnaire. And on that note, I will hand over to Sonia.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you, Rain, as well. So the combination of this consultation work that Lauren has outlined and the evidence review that Hannah led resulted in this set of scales, each with their constituent items that make up the widening participation questionnaire. And the next step and the next stage in our process was to put this questionnaire through a thorough and robust validation process. And that validation process, as Rain has alluded to earlier, is really multi-step and quite involved from a variety of perspectives. And the key and first perspective that was really important to us was that we would focus on the clarity and ease and understanding of the specific items and specific statements within each respective scale, measuring each respective intermediate outcome by learners with a variety of backgrounds, with a variety of educational contexts, and a variety of institutions, and the learners that we as a sector are likely to be working with in terms of widening participation, outreach, student success, student participation work. So that was one of the first key focuses and aims of our validation work. Emerging from that, and I'll take you through the step-by-step process in a couple of minutes, but emerging from that was really a focus on the more, I suppose, the mechanical side of how these scales work. And that is to look at their internal consistency, that is the degree of interrelations between the different items that make up each respective scale. This is often thought of as reliability, and depending on which discipline background you might bring to these topics, but then also to look at the scale's factor structure, that is to see whether their hypothesized, theorized, conceptualized understanding of how they might measure each respective intermediate outcome that we were focusing on, the 7 that Lauren has just talked about, would be reflected in the empirical data that we would be collecting from, again, the same kinds of learners that you and us in the wider sector would be likely to work with. And as part of that, then thinking about the extent of the usability of these scales with a variety of learners at a variety of stages, and a variety of institutional and non-institutional backgrounds in and outside of education. And the final aim of the validation, and that is where we are today calling on you for help and support for the next phase of this project, is to look into predictive validity. That is the extent to which these measures of these intermediate outcomes are indeed related to these later outcomes that we're hoping our respective widening participation or outreach programs are affecting. So if we're thinking of higher education access, if we're thinking of progression, if we're thinking, or so through higher education, if we're thinking of particular outcomes around participation or graduation and beyond, then we want to understand to what extent these intermediate outcomes are related to those. And that's what we mean by predictive validity. So in the validation process overall, as a step-by-step process, we started with that combination of the evidence review and the consultation with the sector, deciding on this short list of scales. And within that, then we took that short list of skills to the learners as the very first step, and something that we call cognitive testing, though it's much more than just thinking about how they're thinking about these skills. It is also a process that looks into how individual students, again, from a variety of backgrounds and in a variety of educational institutions, respond to the specific items, statements, and the response options themselves that would end up making up each respective skill. So we talked to 12 learners. And yes, that number is not huge, but in this space of validation, it's actually quite substantial because they spent an awful lot of time with us, walking us through their reactions, their interpretations, and their understandings of each respective item. Telling us when words didn't work, telling us when phrasings were just a bit too unclear or anything like that. They also told us that some items worked really well and they could engage with them quite straightforwardly. And all of that we took and then used to revise and revisit the scales to look at the specific items and try to adapt them from their original version into something that would be reflective of the feedback from individual learners. We then put that new revised version of the scale to the test in a survey conducted with both learners in a variety of types of education institutions and higher education institutions, and learners not in education at the time of responding to the survey, yet in the same range of relevant ages, between roughly 16 and 22. And we looked at the characteristics of the scales, and we essentially did all of the analysis looking towards the aims of that I just looked at it on the previous scale, with data coming out from that new survey. We also, and this is where the collaboration with the Brilliant Club proved incredibly fruitful, looked at a variety of data that the Brilliant Club had itself collected over time to further do analysis, again, on some, not all, of the scales and items that were included in this set in the WP questionnaire itself. And again, we undertook a process of revision. And if this feels iterative, it is because it actually was, and took quite a substantial amount of time to come together again and again and revisit each item within each scale. And because from steps 3 and 4, some of the items and some of the scales had emerged as not performing quite as well as we would have wanted to, we undertook another set of revisions, trying out various other small tweaks to the response scale as well, and did a further set of 2 surveys, both with learners so pre-higher education and then some in higher education, and arrived at the set of skills that you today can access on the TASO website. And it's this step 6 that we are now looking forward to undertaking in collaboration with yourselves, where we are hoping that the wider sector will be using these skills to collect data and then share with us in a way that Rain will explain in a couple of minutes. But the idea is that we would be working with the sector, and we would be really keen in particular to hear from a variety of specialist institutions, FE colleges, the whole range of higher education providers and related, with data so that we can work on that predictive validity point. And that is exactly where we hope to end up in 2023. I'm not going to specify an exact month or week for that, but we're hoping it will be in the earlier part of 2023, whereby again this final step of the validation process will enable us to revisit, review, and then launch an updated and final WP questionnaire, again for use of the wider sector. We can go, perfect. So now that we have a broad understanding of what the WP questionnaire is, and that there are these 7 scales that we have put together for the use of the sector, it's really important, I think, for us to make sure that everyone leaves this webinar with a kind of a good understanding of how you can use the questionnaire and to what end ultimately. So in terms of the available resources, the questionnaire itself is the first and foremost resource that is being made available today. The 7 scales will be accessible online, and once you access the WP questionnaire, you'll see all of the respective items, the prompts, and a variety of other information such as the response options, all of those things for you to be able to then use these questionnaires. If you then are interested in the background to all of this work, TASO today have published the rapid evidence review that Lauren and Hannah worked on together with the whole team, and that offers you a full and comprehensive account of the evidence around intermediate outcomes and how they might be measured. And it provides the detail as to why we took the steps that we took and agreed on the sets of intermediate outcomes that we agreed ultimately for this project. And alongside this rapid evidence review sits the note on validation, and that gives you a little bit more detail than what I've done already on the process of validation, specify sample sizes, our statistical approaches, and a few things around that. The detail in which we go in that note on validation isn't huge, because there will be a substantially enhanced and more detailed validation process technical note to come out once we've completed this current phase of the work with your support, hopefully. And finally, and most importantly, is the guidance document that guides you through the use of the WP questionnaire, and in particular, specific skills within that. Again, all of this is available on the TASO website, and I believe my colleagues will be placing the link to that in the chat. Great, wonderful. Thank you very much for that. That guidance note is really important because it sketches out a multi-step process for how you might go about using these questionnaire skills for your own purposes, but also in support of this project, which looks to take one final big step towards providing the sector with a fully validated set of scales. So a final word from me then on the use of the WP questionnaire. And all of this information is contained within the guidance document. And I'm not going to go through a huge amount of detail on all of the steps, but it is important to note that we have considered and designed the WP questionnaire and this guidance document in relation to TASO's own framework of evaluation and its own approach and guidance around everything to do with evaluation more broadly. So the first step within our guidance, therefore, is to identify the program that you're hoping to evaluate. And the second step sits alongside that, which is to design your evaluation. But it is essential for us and really important, and has been throughout this project, for us to say that we are not prescribing any form of evaluation or any framework or any approach to evaluation by providing the sector with this WP questionnaire. the aim of it is to plug in to whatever form, shape, approach to evaluation you deem fit for the program that you are trying to evaluate. And within that is this critical point around where these intermediate outcomes for which we have developed a set of scales sit alongside your program. And that's step 3 in the guidance that you can see on your screen that suggests that you should specify your outcomes and then specify the measures that might use them, is precisely where this WP questionnaire might come in to help. But that is not to say that these intermediate outcomes and these scales are the only outcomes that you might be interested. Not at all. We recognize that there's a huge range and huge variety of approaches within the sector in terms of outreach, in terms of WP, in terms of student success work. So if there is that alignment between the outcome that your program, that you are seeking to evaluate with the evaluation approach that is sensible within your context, aligns with the set of intermediate outcomes that the WP questionnaire contains, then and only then you can use that WP questionnaire and use those validated scales as measures in your evaluation approach. Whatever that evaluation approach, again, will look like. And that might mean having a comparison group, or it might mean not having a comparison group. It might mean doing a before and after view. It might mean trying to develop some type 3 evidence and apply this within the context of an experimental study or an RCT, or simply look what happens after. In any case, the point is that you will have developed your evaluation approach to respond to your program. And if the outcomes intended for your program align with those of captured by the WP questionnaire, then we're in business. And we're even more in business if you feel as an institution, as an organization, as a team, that it would be really good to use existing structures and existing data collection methods to support the collection of the data that would be generated by the use of the WP questionnaire. And we are very lucky to have been able to work with colleagues at HEAT to put the WP questionnaire onto the HEAT system. So to make it accessible to the sector for the purposes of data collection via HEAT. And we can hear more about this from HEAT in the later part of today. And also there are links from the TASO website and the guidance document into HEAT and back. So they speak to each other. That doesn't mean, though, that if you don't use HEAT, you can't use the WP questionnaire. And we have designed a tool to help you collect data. If you don't use HEAT, it takes the form of a spreadsheet. Again, you'll be able to access once you have gone through the TASO website, and it supports the collection of the data, and it gives you an indication of the overall and total scores on each of these scales, whichever you decide to use in the context of your program and your evaluation, and then suggests how you might then take them and use them for analysis in your own work. All of this is to say that that guidance document that you can now access on the TASO website contains all of these steps with guidance, with details, and with support, and with links to HEAT. And that takes me to the end of my presentation bit, and it's my duty now to hand over to Rain.
Super, thank you. So we're nearly there in terms of content, and we will come to all of your questions. I guess the final thing is to say, if you are sitting watching this webinar at home or in the office and you're thinking, how can I now have that questionnaire or have those items to be able to start using them and implementing, there are kind of 2 key ways to do that. So one of those ways is through HEAT, as Sonia has described. If you are an existing HEAT member, you can use the existing HEAT survey tool, and these TASO scales will now appear on that survey tool. So you won't have seen them yesterday, but they are there today. And straight after this webinar, you can go and look at them, and you can implement that with your learners in the way that you would any other questionnaire or scale. The second way is through the TASO website. So again, immediately after this webinar, you can go to the TASO website and access each of these survey scales, so the 7 that are on screen. In practical terms, it will look like a Word document. You have to go through a WordPress form on the TASO website. So we will collect some details from you, very simple, just your name, your email address, and we'll ask you a couple of questions, including whether or not we can contact you and ask you to share the anonymized student data back with us so that we can finish the validation process and publish a fully validated scale in the spring or summer term. So to be able to access the questionnaire, you will need to fill out that web form, and you will then be directed to a download page where you can just download it as a Word document. So you'll have each of these 7 scales with all of the items that relate to each outcome, and you can use that to implement into your own data collection tool. You might use a survey platform, Smart Survey or something similar, and you can literally copy and paste the items and the scales across and do it that way. You can use it as a paper questionnaire if you work with students in a classroom who fill out paper and pen questionnaires. You can also use it that way, and the questionnaire that you will download from the TASO website is amenable to both methodologies and is purposely designed in such a way that you can take the data, take the statements and use it in the way that's most useful for you. This is covered in the guidance, and hopefully everyone will read the guidance, but it is very important for the validation process that you don't change the questionnaire items. So although it's a Word document and it's available for you to kind of copy and paste into the format that you need it, we ask that you don't edit those items or those questions in any way, and that is explained thoroughly in the guidance. So I think we can move on to Q&A and answer questions that you have both on the process, be that the kind of evidence synthesis process, the validation process, but also very happy to field practical questions. You might be looking at the HEAP tool right now, you might be looking at the TASO website right now, and if anything's not working or you can't work it out, we can also assist with that now.